All right, well, Kentucky, number 6, Ole Miss. Ole Miss, 17.5-point favorite. The over-under I have for this one is 79 Trey Harris receiving yards. Yes, I'm going to talk about Trey Harris again because I have to. I just
Over.
have to.
Over.
Uh, there's one little caveat here that I'll get to in a second that the under might hit, but there's a reason why I picked 79 receiving yards.
Maxwell Harris. Yep.
Yeah, Maxwell Harrison's a really good player. Unfortunately, Deion Walker, I did not have him among my top 10 SEC players as he recommended, but that's a different subject for a different time. I want to see if I could dig this up because of how good Harris has been with 628 receiving yards through 4 games. With 79 receiving yards on Saturday, he would have the most pre-October receiving yards of any Power 5 receiver in the playoff era.
Oh my
Think about
goodness.
that. Yeah. He would have the most receiving yards of any Power 5 receiver since Brandon Cooks at Oregon State 2013. He had 807 pre-October receiving yards that season. I'm going to guess that Trey Harris isn't going to hit 180 receiving yards on Saturday because, again, Maxwell Harrison, pretty darn good player, very good cover corner, kind of a walking pick six. Even if he doesn't necessarily, even if it's a game in which Trey Harris gets a fair amount of targets, there could still be a lot more instances in which Jackson Dart goes, nope, I'm just going to not pick on that guy. Let's see if Juice Wells is open. Let's
I
see
was
what
going
we
to say,
can do.
who's the number 2 receiver?
Juice Wells has had Juice Wells had a nice resurgence so far, and being healthy, you're reminded this guy is a pretty special player, and it's a bummer. I know South Carolina fans that he wasn't able to be on the field last year. Let's just say that, be on the field. But Harrison's a big reason why this Kentucky defense has only allowed 2 passing touchdowns in its first 4 games, both of which I thought were kind of blown assignments in the South Carolina game when I thought that defense was absolutely gassed. Can't really blame them for that. How does Ole Miss as a whole handle what will easily be, in my opinion, the toughest defense that it has faced so far? Does that banged up Ole Miss offensive line, is that able to kind of hold up well? Can they run the ball against a top 10 run defense? Speaking of the Ole Miss ground attack, Will, it's getting weird with your boy Ulysses Bentley the fourth. Real weird. He is the 3rd string running back on this team, and nobody seems to know why.
Yeah.
Not even his dad, who's tweeting and doing that stuff. Parents tweeting, I'm dealing with the Roman Dunze thing right now as a Bears fan. Parents tweeting negativity as it relates to their son or daughter's playing time isn't my biggest thing, but it kind of just speaks to the head scratching nature of this situation. And I get it. Like Henry Parrish playing extremely well. His return to Ole Miss, that's a big part of why Ulysses Bentley hasn't played. Maybe even the simple acquisition of Henry Parrish can kind of shed some light on that, because I thought that was a really interesting post-spring move for Lane to go into the portal and get Parrish when you knew that Logan Diggs was going to be working his way back from injury. And I kind of looked at that and wondered if Lane just saw a longer timetable for his return after he transferred from LSU. And I thought, all right, well, that maybe helps them with the depth. They're trying to build a roster for a playoff run. It kind of makes sense to get somebody in there that already knows the offense, but maybe they knew something about Bentley that just wasn't necessarily right, because that guy's in year 3 of this offense. He came back for a 6th season of college football in hopes of getting more work, right? With Judkins leaving for Ohio State. That was something we were talking about early in, January even. And so far, he's got 16 carries for 62 yards. He's 3rd among Ole Miss running backs in carries. He's 5th among that group in rushing yards. And his snap count week by week is 21, 12, 3, and 4. They're getting JJ Pegues in there for goal line carries.
I was about
instead
to
of
say
him.
he's got 40 more rushing yards than JJ Pegues is how he's getting used.
JJ Pegues has 2 rushing touchdowns. Bentley's got none. And he's got 11. JJ Pegues has 11 fewer carries than Ulysses Bentley through 4 games. All right. Mm-hmm. Like we love JJ Pegues, but like that's significant. That's probably about the only drama that you can find with this Ole Miss team so far. It's been a very drama-free start for how favorable of a schedule they've had. And I do think that the Kentucky defense will make it a tougher day at the office than it's been so far for Ole Miss. But I think the matchup that might feel most overwhelming is that Ole Miss defensive front against the Big Blue Gate. It's the Big Blue Gate. Okay? Mm-hmm. It is. And I know they did all right against Georgia. They did all right. Second half, they were still not exactly holding up for Brock Vandegrift. But I think Walter Nolan and Princely Umanmiel and those guys have come in and been as advertised. I mean, everything that Lane and Pete Golding could have hoped for, they have been so far. And I was one in saying I think Walter Nolan's kind of overrated coming into the season. He has shut me up. He has looked the part on that defensive front. And I think even if the very underrated Jared Ivey doesn't return for this game, he was dealing with an ankle injury that he suffered against Wake Forest. I think that group should dominate up front. So I'm going to go 28-14 Ole Miss. So it's a narrow cover for Kentucky, but I think it's a game that Ole Miss feels like it's going to win throughout. I think they get off to a nice fast start and they run the ball kind of throughout later on, and it's not necessarily a game in which you feel like Kentucky has much of a chance.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting about that too with Ulysses Bentley is that underratedly Lane has been a guy who like has really good competition. Like
Always.
yeah, like because we talked about that with Spitzer, what was his name? Sanders, the backup quarterback from Oklahoma State that came in and just never played.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting dude's name because he never played because they had Jackson Dart and he was already kind of like it was kind of like when he was in that weird like situationship with Jackson Dart and he didn't know if he wanted to start over. Or
brought in two portal guys. Brought in Walker Howard as well, coming over from LSU. Yeah. Walker Howard, by the way, speaking of third string guys, he's third string. Austin Simmons has passed him up after he moved up 2 classes to reclassify. Like Lane doesn't really care about that as much. Like he doesn't care. You talk about like, popular topic of conversation today with like the UNLV quarterback and promises that have been made. Lane doesn't really care about that whole like promises thing with the depth chart and stuff. And I think that's kind of played out already.
Yeah, it's actually crazy because it's almost like the guys on the higher end. Like, I mean, you can look at like a guy like Kirby and be like, some of these like rotational decisions don't make a ton of sense, or it's like, oh, you got this transfer and you're playing it, whatever. So yeah, it's actually I respect and commend Lane on that, where it's not like, oh, you're giving some, Brian Kelly is the worst at this. I should just make fun of my own coach, where it's like, oh, you brought in this transfer from Oregon State or whatever, and he just like is bad but keeps playing. Like we never see that at Ole Miss, and like that makes sense, right? Because they have a very egalitarian offense where they're just distributing the ball to whoever can get it. To your point about Maxwell Harrison, like if they just decide to not look that way and they just throw the ball to Juice Wells, that probably will work. And I think that we could talk about Kentucky and kind of where they are at this point in their season. We talked about they had the stinker against South Carolina, which I think we then kind of said, that's kind of a puke in your shoes game. They played well against Georgia. Well, here's the thing. You can't play that way against Ole Miss. The way they played against Georgia, if they play exactly that game, and that might be their best game of the season, if they play that exact game, you're getting smoked because you got to go for that 4th down, even if you get in that position against Ole Miss, because Lane will go for it and he'll get it. Whereas, like, you just never know with Kirby when he's being conservative. This is kind of a nightmare matchup for, Kentucky because of that reason, right? That even if they play their best game, they just, I don't think, have the horses. They got receivers that have been around forever but keep dropping the ball. They got a quarterback who has been around forever but can't really, like, get into his offense and feel like a leader and feel like he's really like going through his progression. And to your point about the offensive line, I mean, this is what happens when you have, like all these new offensive coordinators. Guys just don't really know what their job is and they don't really know what their assignment is. And that offense is just kind of in disarray. And that's Ole Miss is literally the worst team in America to play when you're in that situation because once again, a draw play up in a cocktail napkin guy, Lane Kiffin. He could get points from anywhere. It doesn't matter. Like if you have, to your point, like, oh, you know what? Let's get Ulysses Bentley out there, line up a receiver. His dad's mad on Twitter. I don't care. Who's going to cover him one-on-one? Like you could see that from Lane, whereas you're never going to get that from Mark Stoops ever. So yeah, I think this was going to be kind of bad. I think it's going to be into the 30s. So I'll probably, I do like 28-14, but I'd go 31-14 in a game that just Kentucky never feels like they have control over. I think to your point, it's like what's weird about Kentucky is that you'd think they'd be this trenches team that's pushing everybody around. Well, exactly what you just hit on. The offensive line versus the defensive line, like Kentucky's offensive line, Ole Miss's defensive line, is like one of the most mismatched units in this game. So what I like about Kentucky, I don't think they'll be able to do against Ole Miss.
This is a game that like 2 years ago, in this game that was a top 10 matchup with Will Levis having the 2 turnovers late in this one. Yep. If it wasn't a top 10 matchup, I think it was a top 15 matchup. Kentucky was definitely in the top 10 at the time of that game. But you need Barryon Brown special teams if you're Kentucky. Like that, you absolutely need that. And maybe like I should have probably put that as like an over-under one Barryon Brown special teams touchdown. You're going to have to probably find some unique ways, I feel like, to move the ball consistently against the Ole Miss defense, which is a sentence I don't often say. I mean, that really is. But so far, and yes, competition is part of it, but so far they have looked the part and they have shown, not necessarily to the degree that Tennessee has, because I think we've talked about the Tennessee level of competition in a different way than we have with Ole Miss. But like so far, they have shown you they can be that unit that might be able to win you an ugly game. And I don't know that Lane has had a whole lot of groups ever in his career, not just at Ole Miss, but ever in his career that he felt like he could truly win ugly with. And maybe this is that type of game where they can kind of get their points early, put the foot, a little, not ease it off the gas a little bit, and kind of be testing the ground game a little bit more. See if you can wear down Kentucky, who I can't imagine that defense is going to feel great at the end of this one, because I think they're going to be on the field a whole lot.
Yep. By the way, that Kentucky Ole Miss matchup was number 7 Kentucky versus number 14 Ole Miss. So
top
times
15.
have changed.
Yeah, that was a fun game. That was a really fun game. Fun down to the wire game. Different feel for where both of these programs are at 2 years later. No doubt about it.